It didn't take me long to make up my mind that these liars weren't no kings nor dukes at all, but just low-down humbugs and frauds. But I never said nothing. If they wanted us to call them kings and dukes, I hadn't no objections, long as it would keep peace in the family. And it weren't no use to tell Jim, so I didn't tell him. If I never learned nothing else out of Pap, I learned that the best way to get along with his kind of people is to let them have their own way. They asked us considerable many questions, wanted to know what we covered up the raft that way for and laid by in the daytime instead of running. Was Jim a runaway slave? Says I, goodness sakes, would a runaway run south? No, they allowed he wouldn't. I had to account for things some way, so I says, my folks was living in Pike County in Missouri, where I was born, and they all died off but me and Pa and my brother Ike. Now, Pa, he allowed he'd go down and live with Uncle Ben, who's got a little one-horse place on the river 44 miles below Orleans. Pa was pretty poor and had some debts, so when he'd squared up, there weren't nothing left but $16 and our slave Jim. Well, when the river rose, Pa had a streak of luck one day. He catched this piece of a raft. We reckoned we'd go down to Orleans on it. Pa's luck didn't hold out. A steamboat run over the forward corner of the raft one night, and we all went overboard and dove under the wheel. Jim and me come up all right, but Pa was drunk, and Ike was only 4, so they never come up no more. Well, for the next day or two, we had considerable trouble, because people was always trying to take Jim away from me, saying they believed he was a runaway. We don't run daytimes no more now. Nights, they don't bother us. The Duke says, leave me alone to cipher out a way so we can run in the daytime if we want to. We'll let it alone for today because, of course, we don't want to go by that town yonder in daylight. It mightn't be healthy. We got away as soon as it was good and dark. I took the watch, and the first light that showed, we slid the raft into hiding quarters for the day. The king got out an old ratty deck of cards after breakfast, and him and the Duke played 7-up a while, 5 cents a game. Then they got tired of it, allowed they'd lay out a campaign, as they called it. There was a little one-horse town about 3 miles down the bend, and after dinner the Duke said he'd ciphered out his idea about how to run in daylight without it being dangersome for Jim. So he allowed he'd go down to the town and fix that thing. When we got there weren't nobody stirring. Streets empty and perfectly dead and still, like Sunday. We found a sick slave sunning himself in a backyard. He said everybody that weren't too young or too sick or too old was gone to camp meeting, about 2 miles back in the woods. The Duke said what he was after was a printing office. We found it. A little bit of a concern up over a carpenter shop. Carpenters and printers all gone to the meeting, no doors locked. The Duke shed his coat and said he was all right now, so me and the king lit out for the camp meeting. There was as much as 1,000 people there from 20 miles around. There was sheds made out of poles and roofed over with branches where they had lemonade and gingerbread to sell, and piles of watermelons and green corn and such like truck. The preaching was going on under some kind of sheds, only they was bigger and held crowds of people. The first shed we came to, the preacher was lining out a hymn. He lined out 2 lines, everybody sung it, and it was kind of grand to hear it. There was so many of them, and they done it in such a rousing way. Then the preacher began to preach, and begun in earnest, too, and went weaving first to one side of the platform and then to the other. And people would shout, "Glory, amen, glory, hallelujah." You couldn't make out what the preacher said anymore on account of the shouting and crying. Well, the first I knowed, the king got a-going, and you could hear him over everybody. The next he went a-charging up onto the platform, and the preacher, he begged him to speak to the people, and he done it. He told him he was a pirate, and his crew was thinned out considerable last spring in a fight, and he was home now to take out some fresh men, and thanks to goodness he'd been robbed last night and put ashore off a steamboat without a cent, and he was glad of it, because he was a changed man now, and poor as he was going to start right off and work his way back to the Indian Ocean and put in the rest of his life trying to turn the pirates into the true path. And then he busted into tears, and so did everybody. Then somebody sings out, "Take up a collection for him! Take up a collection!" So the king went all through the crowd with his hat, swabbing his eyes, blessing the people, and praising them and thanking them for being so good to the poor pirates away off there. When we got back to the raft and he come to count up, he found he'd collected $87.75. And then he had fetched away a 3-gallon jug of whiskey, too, that he found under a wagon when he was starting home through the woods. The Duke was thinking he'd been doing pretty well till the king come to show up, but after that he didn't think so much. He had set up and printed off 2 little jobs for farmers in that printing office, horse bills, and took the money, $4, and he had got in $10 worth of advertisements for the paper, which he said he would put in for $4 if they would pay in advance, so they done it. Then he showed us another little job he'd printed and hadn't charged for because it was for us. It had a picture of a runaway slave with a bundle on a stick over his shoulder and $200 reward under it. The reading was all about Jim and just described him to a dot. Said he run away from St. Jack's Plantation, 40 miles below New Orleans, last winter and likely went north, and whoever would catch him and send him back, he could have the reward and expenses. Says the Duke, "Now after tonight we can run in the daytime if we want to. Whenever we see anybody coming, we can tie Jim hand and foot with a rope and show this handbill and say we captured him up the river and we're too poor to travel on a steamboat, so we got this little raft on credit from our friends and they're going down to get the reward." We all said the Duke was pretty smart and there couldn't be no trouble about running daytimes. The first chance we got, the Duke had some show bills printed, and after that, for 2 or 3 days as we floated along, the raft was a most uncommon lively place, for there weren't nothing but sword fighting and rehearsing, as the Duke called it, going on all the time. The Duke had to learn the king over and over again how to say every speech, and he made him sigh and put his hand on his heart, and after a while he said he'd done it pretty well. He says, "Only you mustn't bellow out Romeo that way like a bull. You must say it soft and sick and languishy. So Romeo. That is the idea, for Juliet's a dear, sweet, mere child of a girl, you know. She don't bray like a jackass." One morning when we was pretty well down the state of Arkansas, we come in sight of a little one-horse town in a big bend. So we tied up about 3/4 of a mile above it. All of us but Jim took the canoe and went down there to see if there was any chance in that place for our show. We struck it mighty lucky. There was going to be a circus there that afternoon, and the country people was already beginning to come in all kinds of old shackly wagons and on horses. The circus would leave before night, so our show would have a pretty good chance. The Duke, he hired the courthouse, and we went around stuck up our bills. They read like this: Shakespeare Revival, for 1 night only. Admission 25 cents. Children and servants 10 cents. Well, that night we had our show, but there weren't only but about 12 people there, just enough to pay expenses. And they laughed all the time. That made the Duke mad. And everybody left anyway before the show was over but one boy, which was asleep. So the Duke said these Arkansas lunkheads couldn't come up to Shakespeare. What they wanted was low comedy, and maybe something rather worse than low comedy, he reckoned. So next morning he drawed some handbills and stuck 'em all over the village. The bills said, "At the courthouse, for 3 nights only, the world-renowned tragedians, David Garrick the Younger and Edmund Kean the Elder, in their thrilling tragedy of The King's Camelopard, or The Royal Nonsuch. Admission 50 cents. Then at the bottom was the biggest line of all, which said, "Ladies and children not admitted." Says the Duke, "There, if that line don't fetch him, I don't know Arkansas." Well, all day, him and the king was hard at it, rigging up a stage and a curtain and a row of candles for footlights. And that night the house was jam full of men in no time. When the place couldn't hold no more, the Duke, he quit tending the door and went around the back way and come onto the stage and stood up before the curtain and made a little speech. and praised up this tragedy and said it was the most thrillingest one that ever was, and at last when he got everybody's expectations up high enough, he rolled up the curtain, and the next minute the king came a-prancing out on all fours, naked, and he was painted all over, ring-streaked and striped, all sorts of colors as splendid as a rainbow. And, well, but never mind the rest of his outfit. It was just wild, but it was awful funny. The people most killed themselves laughing, and when the king capered off behind the scenes, they roared and clapped and stormed and haw-hawed till he came back and done it all over again, and after that they made him do it another time. Then the Duke, he lets the curtain down and bows to the people, and he says the great tragedy will be performed only 2 nights more on accounts of pressing London engagements, and says if he has succeeded in pleasing them and instructing them, he will be deeply obliged if they will mention it to their friends and get them to come and see it. 20 people sings out, "What, is it over? Is that all?" The Duke says yes. Then there was a fine time. Everybody sings out "sold" and rose up mad, and was a-going for that stage and them tragedians. But a big fine-looking man jumps up on a bench and shouts, "Hold on, just a word, gentlemen." They stopped to listen. "We are sold, mighty badly sold, but we don't want to be the laughingstock of this whole town, I reckon, and never hear the last of this as long as we live. No, what we want is to go out of here quiet and talk this show up and sell the rest of the town. Then we'll all be in the same boat. Ain't that sensible?" Next day you couldn't hear nothing around that town but how splendid that show was. House was jammed again that night, and we sold this crowd the same way. When me and the king and the Duke got home to the raft, we all had a supper, and by, about midnight, they made Jim and me back her out and float her down the middle of the river and hide her about 2 miles below town. The third night the house was crammed again, and they weren't newcomers this time, but people that was at the show the other 2 nights. I stood by the Duke at the door, and I see that every man that went in had his pockets bulging, and I see it warn't no perfumery either, not by a long sight. I smelt sickly eggs by the barrel and rotten cabbages, and if I know the signs of a dead cat being around, and I bet I do, there was 64 of 'em went in. Well, when the place couldn't hold no more people, the Duke, he gave a fellow a quarter and told him to tend door for him a minute, and then he started around for the stage door, I after him. But the minute we turned the corner and was in the dark, he says, "Walk fast now till you get away from the houses, and then run for the raft like the Dickens was after you." I done it, and he done the same. We struck the raft at the same time, and in less than 2 seconds we was gliding downstream, all dark and still, and edging towards the middle of the river, nobody saying a word. I reckoned the poor king was in for a gaudy time of it with the audience, but nothing of the sort. Pretty soon he crawls out from under the wigwam and says, "Well, how did the old thing pan out this time, Duke?" He hadn't been uptown at all. We never showed a light till we was about 10 miles below the village. Then we lit up and had a supper, and the king and the Duke fairly laughed their bones loose over the way they'd served them people. We dasn't stop again at any town for days and days. Kept right along down the river. We was down south in the warm weather now, and a mighty long ways from home. We begun to come to trees with Spanish moss on 'em, hanging down from the limbs like long gray beards. It was the first I ever see it growing, and it made the woods look solemn and dismal. So now the frauds reckoned they was out of danger, and they begun to work the villages again. First they done a lecture on temperance, but they didn't make enough for 'em both to get drunk on. Then in another village they started a dancing school, but they didn't know no more how to dance than a kangaroo does. So the first prance they made, the general public jumped in and pranced them out of town. They tackled missionarying and mesmerizing and doctoring and telling fortunes and a little of everything, but they couldn't seem to have no luck. So at last they laid around the raft as she floated along, thinking and never saying nothing, by the half a day at a time, and dreadful blue and desperate. And at last they took a change and begun to lay their heads together in the wigwam and talk low and confidential 2 or 3 hours at a time. Jim and me got uneasy. We didn't like the look of it. We judged they was studying up some kind of worse deviltry than ever. We turned it over and over, and at last we made up our minds they was going to break into somebody's house or store or was going into the counterfeit money business or something. So then we was pretty scared and made up an agreement that we wouldn't have nothing in the world to do with such actions. And if ever we got the least show, we would give 'em the cold shake and clear out and leave them behind. Well, early one morning we hid the raft in a good, safe place about 2 miles below a little bit of a shabby village named Pikesville, and the king he went ashore and told us all to stay hid whilst he went up to town and smelt around to see if anybody had got wind of the royal nonsuch there yet. House to rob, you mean, says I to myself, and when you get through robbing it, you come back here and wonder what's become of me and Jim and the raft. And he said if he weren't back by midday, the Duke and me would know it all right, and we was to come along. So we stayed where we was. The Duke, he fretted and sweated around and was in a mighty sour way. I was good and glad when midday come and no king. So me and the Duke went up to the village and hunted around there for the king. By and by we found him in the back room of a little low doggery, very tight, and a lot of loafers bully-ragging him for sport, and he a-cussing and a-threatening with all his might. The Duke, he begun to abuse him for an old fool, and the king begun to sass back. And the minute they was fairly at it, I lit out and spun down the river road like a deer, for I see our chance. And I made up my mind that it would be a long day before they ever see me and Jim again. I got down there all out of breath, but loaded up with joy, and sung out, "Set her loose, Jim, we're all right now." But there warn't no answer. Nobody come out of the wigwam. Jim was gone. I set up a shout, and then another, and I run this way and that in the woods, whooping and screeching. But it warn't no use. Old Jim was gone. Then I set down and cried. I couldn't help it, but I couldn't set still long. Pretty soon I went out on the road and I run across a boy walking, and I asked him if he'd seen a strange slave dressed so-and-so, and he says, "Down to Silas Phelps' place, 2 miles below here. He's a runaway slave and they've got him. He run off from down south somewheres." "Who nailed him?" "It was an old fella, a stranger, and he sold out his chance in him for $40 because he's got to go up the river and can't wait. I see the handbill myself. It tells all about this slave to a dot, paints him like a picture, and tells the plantation he's from, 40 miles below New Orleans." I went back to the raft and sat down in the wigwam to think, but I couldn't come to nothing. After all this long journey and after all we'd done for them scoundrels, everything all busted up and ruined because they could have the heart to serve Jim such a trick as that and make him a slave again all his life, and among strangers, too, for $40 dirty. I decided I would go to work to steal Jim out of slavery again, and if I could think up anything worse, I'd do that, too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. Then I set to thinking over how to get at it, and at last fixed up a plan that suited me. So then I took the bearings of a woody island that was down the river a piece, and as soon as it was fairly dark, I crept out with my raft and went for it and hid it there, and then turned in. I slept the night through and got up before it was light, and had my breakfast and put on my store clothes, and tied up some other things and one thing or another in a bundle, and took the canoe and cleared for shore. I landed below where I judged was Phelps' place and hid my bundle in the woods. Then I struck up the road, and when I passed the mill, I see a sign on it, Phelps Sawmill. Phelps was one of those little one-horse cotton plantations, and they all look alike. A rail fence round a 2-acre yard, a stile made out of logs sawed off and upended in steps, some sickly grass patches in the big yard, big double log house for the white folks, round log kitchen with a big broad open but roofed passage joining it to the house, a log smokehouse back of the kitchen, 3 little log slave cabins in a row t'other side of the smokehouse, hounds asleep there in the sun, outside of the fence a garden and a watermelon patch, Then the cotton fields begin, and after the fields, the woods. I went right along, not fixing up any particular plan, but just trusting to Providence to put the right words in my mouth when the time come. When I got halfway, first one hound and then another got up and went for me. Of course, I stopped and faced them and kept still. And here comes the white woman running from the house, about 45, 50-year-old, bareheaded and her spinning stick in her hand, and behind her comes her little white children. She was smiling all over so she could hardly stand, and says, "It's you at last, ain't it?" I out with a yes'm before a thought. She grabbed me and hugged me tight and then gripped me by both hands and shook, and the tears come in her eyes and run down over. And she kept saying, "You don't look as much like your mother as I reckoned you would. But law's sakes, I don't care for that. I'm so glad to see you. Children, it's your cousin Tom. Tell him howdy." But they ducked their heads and hid behind her. So then she started for the house, leading me by the hand, and the children tagging after. When we got there, she set me down in a split-bottom chair and set herself down on a little low stool in front of me, holding both of my hands, and she says, "Now I can have a good look at you, and laws of me, I've been hungry for it many a time all these long years, and it's come at last. We've been expecting you a couple of days and more. What kept you? Boat get aground?" Yes'm, she..." "Don't say yes'm. Say Aunt Sally. Your uncle's been up to the town every day to fetch you, and he's gone again not more'n an hour ago. He'll be back any minute now. You must have met him on the road, didn't you? Oldish man with it." "No, I didn't see nobody, Aunt Sally. But here we're a-running on this way, and you hain't told me a word about Sis nor any of 'em. Now I'll rest my works a little, and you start up yourn. Just tell me everything." Well, I see I was up a stump, and up it good. So I says to myself, here's another place where I gotta risk the truth. I opened my mouth to begin, but she grabbed me and hustled me in behind the bed and said, "Here he comes. I'll play a joke on him. Children, don't you say a word." I had just one little glimpse of the old gentleman when he came in, and then the bed hit him. Mrs. Phelps, she jumps for him and says, "Has he come?" "No," says her husband. "Goodness gracious, what in the world can have become of him?" she says. "I can't imagine," says the old gentleman. "And I must say it makes me dreadful uneasy." "Why, Silas, look yonder, up the road. Ain't that somebody coming?" He sprung to the window at the head of the bed, and that give Mrs. Phelps the chance she wanted. She stooped down quick at the foot of the bed, give me a pull, and out I come. And when he turned back from the window, there she stood, a-beaming and a-smiling like a house afire, and I standing pretty meek and sweaty alongside. The old gentleman stared and said, "Why, who's that?" "Well, who do you reckon 'tis?" "I hain't no idea. Who is it?" "It's Tom Sawyer." By James, I almost slumped through the floor. But there warn't no time to swap knives. The old man grabbed me by the hand and shook and kept on shaking. And all the time how the woman did dance around and laugh and cry. But if they was joyful, it warn't nothing to what I was. For it was like being born again. I was so glad to find out who I was. Well, they froze to me for 2 hours, and at last, when my chin was so tired it couldn't hardly go any more, I told them more about my family, I mean the Sawyer family, than ever happened to any 6 Sawyer families. Being Tom Sawyer was easy and comfortable, and it stayed easy and comfortable till by and by I hear a steamboat coughing along down the river. Then I says to myself, suppose Tom Sawyer comes down on that boat, and suppose he steps in here any minute and sings out my name before I can throw him a wink to keep quiet. Well, I couldn't have it that way. I must go up the road and waylay him. So I told the folks I reckoned I'd go up to town and fetch down my baggage. So I started for town in the wagon, and when I was halfway, I see a wagon coming, and sure enough, it was Tom Sawyer. I says, "Hold on," and it stopped alongside, and his mouth opened up like a trunk and stayed so. And he swallowed 2 or 3 times like a person that's got a dry throat, and then says, "I hain't ever done you no harm, so then what do you want to come back and hate me for?" I says, "I hain't come back, I hain't been gone." When he heard my voice, it righted him up some, but he weren't quite satisfied. He says, "You ain't a ghost?" "I ain't," I says. "Well, well, that ought to settle it, of course, but I can't somehow seem to understand it no way. Looky here, weren't you ever murdered at all?" "No, I weren't ever murdered at all. I played it on them." So he wanted to know all about it right off because it was a grand adventure and mysterious, and so it hit him where he lived. But I said leave it alone till by and told his driver to wait. And we drove off a little piece, and I told him the kind of a fix I was in, and what did he reckon we better do? So he thought, and pretty soon he says, "It's all right, I got it. Take my trunk in your wagon and let on its yourn. I'll go towards town a piece and take a fresh start, and get there a quarter or a half an hour after you, and you needn't let on to know me at first." And I says, "All right, but there's one more thing. A thing that nobody don't know but me. And that is there's a slave here that I'm a-trying to steal out of slavery, and his name is Jim. Old Miss Watson's Jim." He says, "What?" "Why, Jim is—" He stopped and went to studying. And I says, "I know what you'll say. You'll say it's dirty, low-down business, but what if it is? I'm low-down, and I'm going to steal him, and I want you to keep mum and not let on. Will you?" His eyes lit up, and he says, "I'll help you steal him." "Oh, shucks," I says, "you're joking." "I ain't joking either." "Well, then," I says, "joking or no joking, if you hear anything said about a runaway slave, don't forget to remember that you don't know nothing about him, and I don't know nothing about him." Then we took the trunk and put it in my wagon, and he drove off his way, and I drove mine. In about half an hour, Tom's wagon drove up to the front stile, and Aunt Sally, she see it through the window and says, "Why, there's somebody come. I wonder who 'tis. Why, I do believe it's a stranger. Jimmy," that's one of the children, "run and tell Lize to put on another plate for dinner." Everybody made a rush for the front door because, of course, a stranger don't come every year. Tom was over the stile and starting for the house. The wagon was spinning up the road for the village, and we was all bunched in the front door. Tom says, "Mr. Archibald Nichols, I presume?" "No, my boy," says the old gentleman. "I'm sorry to say your driver has deceived you. Nichols' place is down a matter of 3 miles more. Come in and eat your dinner with us, and then we'll hitch up and take you down to Nichols's." Tom reached over and kissed Aunt Sally right in the mouth, but she wiped it off with the back of her hand and says, "You audacious puppy." He looked kind of hurt and says, "I'm surprised at you, ma'am." "Say, what do you mean by kissing me?" "Well, they told me you'd like it." "Well, whoever told you's another lunatic, and who's they?" Then he looks on around to me and says, "Tom, didn't you think Aunt Sally'd open out her arms and say, 'Sid Sawyer'?" "My land," she says, breaking in and jumping for him. "You impudent young rascal to fool a body so." She hugged him and kissed him over and over again, and then turned him over to the old man, and he took what was left. And after they got a little quiet again, she says, "Why, dear me, I never seen such a surprise. Sis never wrote to me about anybody coming but him. It's because it weren't intended for any of us to come but Tom. But I begged, and at the last minute she let me come too. So coming down the river, me and Tom thought it would be a first-rate surprise for him to come here to the house first, and for me to by and by tag along and drop in and let on to be a stranger." We had dinner out in the open passage twixt the house and the kitchen, and there was things enough on that table for 7 families, and all hot, too. There was a considerable good deal of talk all the afternoon, and me and Tom was on the lookout all the time, but they didn't happen to say nothing about any runaway slave. But at supper at night, one of the little boys says, "Pa, mayn't Tom and Sid and me go to the show?" "No," says the old man. "I reckon there ain't going to be any, because the runaway slave told Burton and me all about that scandalous show, and Burton said he would tell the people, so I reckon they've drove the audacious loafers out of town before this time." So there it was. Tom and me was to sleep in the same room and bed. So, being tired, we bid good night and went up to bed right after supper, and clumb out of the window and down the lightning rod and shoved for town. For I didn't believe anybody was going to give the king and the duke a hint, and so if I didn't hurry up and give 'em one, they'd get into trouble sure.